That makes me want to bring up some statistics, if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
absolutely.
That's part of my own art practice and making work for the show, but I also saw it on your website as well. So maybe you can help me with the statistics. So I know about 51% of gun deaths are due to suicide.
Mhm.
And on your website, it explains that a large portion of those are to people within the queer community, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's one of the things that I'll just say that sharing the stories of suicide are even more complicated, right? Because families often uh, you could be telling something about someone's story that wasn't really yours to tell.
Mhm.
So I think when we do look at the overwhelmingly large number of suicide deaths by guns, we try to make sure that we're telling stories where families have really shared that this was a suicide story. And often they're doing so to help to hope to prevent further suicide gun violence in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely like a very touching issue when you start to look at the statistics of who are most affected by gun violence. And you've already mentioned like Black trans women.
Yeah.
I believe it's something like a woman is 4 times more likely to be killed in a domestic violence situation if there's a gun in the home.
Mhm.
um, it is shocking when you look at the statistics as to how much death by a gun or an injury by a gun increases when there's a gun in the home. Um,
Right, and one of the things that we've seen in the pandemic was an increase of children in accidental gun deaths because they were home and actually in some ways less supervised or not carefully supervised in ways that included a greater access to guns on a regular basis. Like normally they would have been in school, but as a result of being home all day, they were actually encountering guns in an increased way. And the spring sent us way too many stories of little ones who were shot by a sibling by accident, or they picked up the gun themselves and were playing with it. It was really the spring was really heartbreaking to sort of see the actual impact of the pandemic on gun violence.
and gun sales went up as
Yeah,
the pandemic hit.
yeah. So one of the figures that I just saw from Everytown for Gun Safety is that in June alone, an estimated 2.3 million guns were sold. In June alone of 2020, 2.3 million guns were sold, and that's a 149% increase from last year. That in some ways our response to the crises that our country is facing in was to pour more gun violence into it. That's how we responded. Uh,
It's to
and
protect yourself against something you cannot see and has nothing to do with protecting
correct,
yourself against. It's just a
yeah.
logic. Oh,
The National Gun Memorial site, as of today, was saying that there were 67,941 gun deaths since the start of 2020. That it does include suicide, and also if the perpetrator was killed by a gun, they're also in that group as well. For Gays Against Guns, we don't tell the stories. We don't name perpetrators in our stories. So if you were killed by your husband, we don't use his name. We don't share details about the perpetrators, and we sort of really try to keep our focus on the lives of those killed by gun violence, and often that's someone's children and their partner. I mean, that's one of the most common categories of gun death is to be killed by someone in your house.
yeah. You've almost taken on an insurmountable task of honoring all the victims of gun violence because there's just so many to cover,
Yeah.
um, even just within a year. That must be very hard, especially to sift through all the information and decide who should be represented.
Almost every day I'm sort of looking through, there might be 20 new people that show up on the National Gun Memorial site, Currently, right now, we're really refocused back again on the rise of gun violence in New York, and so we're looking primarily at the stories in our own city and what those patterns are and those circumstances and the people who've been killed by gun violence, which is disproportionately Black citizens. Transgender deaths are always something that we have on our main agenda to make sure that we're paying attention to. Again, in part because there's so much that goes into those lives and deaths being invisible or
Mhm.
misreported or underreported, and so I think we know that we're going to want to be really showing up and being present. I remember the stories of the people whose lives I've held in that way. Sometimes, members of GAG will hear from a family member of someone who's been killed that they just can't believe that someone who didn't know their child, their loved one, is continuing to hold their memory in that way. And I think that's partially why we do it. We're focusing on lives. I mean, obviously, we're telling the story about these lives because they've been killed by guns. So that's the primary focus. But I think because we focus on trying to celebrate and honor the life of the person, um, we reach sometimes people who might not particularly be anti-gun in the way that we are, but are glad that the victims are being honored. Some point in the spring, uh, I wrote a very caring profile about a woman who had been killed in a domestic violence experience, and her photos were all her um, wearing Trump, Trump slogans and T-shirts and materials, and was and I brought as much honor and as love and care to her profile as I had anybody else's. And because you know what, that otherwise we shouldn't be doing it, right? I mean, and there were some moments where I thought to myself, like, if I post these photos, will there be a negative reaction? And if there is, then what will I need to do, or what will we need to do to make sure that she's treated with the respect that we ask all of our stories to be met with? And she was. Really. Well, and also too, one of the things that that it really drew me to this conversation is that I also have my own art practice that includes some work around the work that I do with Gays Against Guns. And so when I share a profile of a person who's been killed by gun violence on the Human Beings Facebook page, I do all this research. I look for photos. I try to tell the story to the best of what material that's there. And then personally, I've been adding the name and the date and the age of the person onto a garment I'm making, as a way of kind of letting go for myself, of sort of acknowledging that I'm holding these stories, I'm holding the memory of these stories, and to sort of to put that into my hands in an artful way has been really helpful. I think it's also a way that art has helped me mark the experience of witnessing, and to be able to have that be a way that I kind of transmute my own experience or my own closeness to this. Um, Obviously, the stories and that all that research are looking at some of the worst of what our country is doing, right? I mean, that's that in all of these stories, there is this American story that I wish we could be doing differently than this. Today I shared a story on the Human Beings page for Garrett Foster. Was killed last night. He's was killed in Austin, shot in the Black Lives Matter protest, where he and his fiance, who is a woman, a Black woman in a wheelchair. Garrett was a white veteran, and they had been attending the protests for the last 50 days. And he was shot by a person who drove into the protesters and then shot Garrett several times at the end of that incident. Garrett was carrying a weapon himself, right? Texas is an open carry state. And as a vet, he had been carrying a rifle that he had a license for. And I share that because when I tell that story, I have my opinions about guns, but that's also not part of telling his story, right? And I think that's really important to acknowledge that the choice is that he was killed in a state where he had every right to be carrying the weapon he was carrying. Um, I will say for myself, I'm glad I don't live in a state where people can be carrying assault rifles on the street every day. But I understand that in his state, he was doing absolutely nothing that should have resulted in his death in this way. And obviously, the fact that as a vet, he was, aware of what he was doing, and also the importance of the actions that he was taking in terms of supporting social justice.
Yeah, that story really brings to light how the current system is just not working to help protect Americans and anyone else for that matter, and how there needs to be revisions to it and changes. This idea of empathy as activism to put a face to a cause, a victim to an issue is something that I think is really, really powerful. There's so many different strategies that people employ to fight against certain powers and abuses, but uh, I personally don't think anyone should underestimate the power of that idea of empathy and to spread it, because I think we're finding that we could use a little bit more of it right now.
Yeah, and I think that as one of the jobs that I've taken on at Gays Against Guns is to be one of the people who really does develop the profiles of the stories that we share. So I spend a lot of time reading a lot of news articles about really awful things that happen to people across the country, and often wading through the biases of the reporting, the biases of the newspaper, the biases of particularly for transgender victims, the dead naming or the misgendering that happens, and the way that is an additional harm and a damage that is inflicted upon families and the memory of their loved ones. I'll just say that I've noticed some change in the last year or so in the way that those stories have been reported in the papers. I'm seeing an improved narrative that's not just about the horrific circumstances of their death, but also an attempt to make sure that loved ones and friends are being heard as well. When we tell those stories with honor and care, even though they are a story of tragedy, we're still bringing love and an attempt to share the joyousness of a life, of a family that cared about them or their friends. And I think that